Hey everybody, welcome to the cell lecture. We're going to be learning about plant cells, animal cells, organelles, um, the cell theory, history of microscopes, and transport within the cell, as well as a few other things. It's going to be a longer lecture since there's so much material to cover, but it's very good information. It's everything that is important. There's nothing that is not important in this lecture. So keep that in mind. I like to filter things down to what is important. I don't like to waste your time or my time discussing things that you won't see or discussing things that would be really superfluous to what our goals would be. So let's begin. Living things. There are seven major characteristics of life. All living things have cellular organization. They contain similar chemicals. They use energy. They grow, develop, respond to their surroundings, and reproduce. If you are considered alive, you must meet these seven conditions or these seven characteristics. If you do not meet these seven characteristics, then you are not alive. A cell is the basic unit of structure and function of an organism. They are the building blocks of all of life. Every living thing is made of cells. Every living thing is made of cells. And what's really interesting about cells is that, we think that they're all this one small thing. They're just super microscopic and they're all the same size. But the fact of the matter is that cell sizes can vary. Most cells are small, and so about 40 human cells would fit on the dot of this letter I. So the I that you see there, about 40 human cells would fit in that dot. Some cells are big, like this egg. This egg yolk is one cell. It's one giant cell. So not all cells are microscopic, and the smallest cells are so tiny that you could fit over 1 million of them in the period at the end of this sentence. So cells are pretty interesting. They're not just this one small dumb thing. They are very complex. They can be very large or incredibly tiny, and they all do these specialized functions. What's really interesting is that cells are made of molecules. Okay, so molecules are tiny particles of matter. Molecules are made up of atoms. The atom is the basic fundamental unit of matter, and atoms are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Here's the crazy thing, all right? If you want to sit down, think about this, and do some research on this, cells which are living are made of molecules which are non-living. So you might want to ask yourself, well, at what point does non-living become living? At what point do atoms and molecules gain consciousness and fall into those seven characteristics of life? Now, it's really interesting because if you think about it, well, we are living things because we're made of cells, but if our cells are made of non-living things, are we really living? Yes, we are living, all based on those seven characteristics of life, but at what point would we consider a cell alive, or at what point would we consider atoms and molecules alive? It's very interesting stuff. This is one of the reasons I really like science. You could sit there and through the natural, or through the understanding of how things work, you could ask these really interesting questions and maybe spend a lifetime figuring out the answer. So organisms can be composed of only one cell, like this bacteria over here, or many cells, like us. Unicellular or single-celled organisms include bacteria, which are actually the most numerous organisms on Earth. I don't know if there's a number that exists that can quantify the amount of bacteria on Earth. Multicellular organisms are composed of many cells, obviously. We're made up of trillions of cells. Human body, fun fact, average 75 trillion cells. Who figured that out? Some really smart people with a lot of time on their hands. And we have specialized cells in our body that perform specific functions. So not all of our cells do the same job. We have skin cells that have specific functions. We have liver cells that have specific functions, stomach cells that have specific functions. So not every cell is the same. Every cell is alive, and they have, there's groups of cells that have different jobs, and they all work together to keep each other alive. The most abundant chemical in cells is water. So water is the main chemical of life. Other chemicals called carbohydrates are the energy source for the cell. So think of it like the fuel for a car. Without carbohydrates, we won't have any energy. We also have proteins and lipids. Lipids are fats, and these two are the building blocks. I'm sorry, the building materials for cell. So just much like wood and bricks are the building materials for houses, we wouldn't be able to, a cell wouldn't be able to exist without proteins and lipids. Proteins do everything from transporting nutrients to replicating DNA, replicating RNA, everything within a cell. It's very, very important. And then the nucleic acids are the genetic material. So the main chemicals of the cell are water, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Remember that. The cells of organisms use energy to do what living things must do, okay, such as grow and repair injured parts. Cells are always hard at work. There's no such thing as a cell that's taking a break. They're always, like, their entire lifespan, which is typically 24 hours, is about growing and then replicating through mitosis or meiosis, depending on what kind of cell they are, and doing their jobs, as they're growing and as they're doing. We are always, our cells are always dividing just about every 24 hours. So right now our cells are not only busy with our eyes and brain, but our blood cells are moving chemicals around our body. And this is what white blood cells look like. I know what you're thinking, but Mr. R, they're purple. Well, that's because they just colored them purple, but that's what a white blood cell looks like. They're quite large, and it's very cool. Once you learn about the immune system, you'll learn more about the white blood cells. Well, cells wouldn't be, or we wouldn't really know anything about cells without the invention of the microscope. So the microscope made it possible for people to discover and learn about cells. A microscope is an instrument that makes small objects look larger. And a light microscope, like the one pictured over here, has more than one lens called a compound microscope. Okay? So it could be a light microscope or a compound microscope. This is something we used in class during our lab. Man by the name of Robert Hooke discovered, quote unquote, cells. So in 1663, he observed the structure of a thin slice of cork using a compound microscope, and that's how that thin slice of cork looked like. He saw these little blocks that resembled cells, okay, that resembled rooms, I'm sorry, and then he called them cells. So that's why a cell is called a cell, because this guy saw these, and he's like, these look like compartments, like cells, let's call these cells. Okay, so these are dead cells. And a man, a very well-dressed man named Anton van Leeuwenhoek, also began to observe tiny objects with his microscope, and he was the first to discover single-celled organisms. He took a drop of pond water, put it under his microscope, and he saw single-celled organisms living and moving in the water. It's very cool. The cell theory. So observations from Hooke and Leeuwenhoek led to the development of the cell theory. The cell theory states, this is incredibly important. This is one of the foundational principles of all of molecular biology. So know this. All living things are composed of cells. If you're not composed of cells, you're not living. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living things, and all cells are produced from other cells. So you will only get a cell from another cell. You will not get a cell from anything else. And if you're curious, these are red blood cells. Okay, these are the cells that carry oxygen and nutrients throughout our entire bodies. That's how they look like. And this is where this dip, this like donut like shape, that's where they carry all our oxygen and nutrients. It's very cool. The platelets. So let's look inside cells. It's not just this big thing. There's actually stuff inside that allows it to work that's even smaller than it. So cells contain even smaller structures inside called organelles, and they're called organelles because when early scientists saw them, they looked like inner organs. Kind of like our heart, kidneys, and brain. So instead of an organ, organelle. Just, like I said, a play on words. So we're going to start talking about the organelles. The first organelle we're going to speak of is the cell wall. Now this is an image of a plant cell, and this is the image of an animal cell. Notice that the plant cell is kind of rigid. It has a rectangular shape. Animal cell is kind of gelatinous. That's because only the plant cell has a cell wall. Only the plant cell has a cell wall. The cell wall is a rigid layer of non-living material that surrounds the cells of plants and some other organisms. Cell walls look rectangular and in shape and are only found in plant cells. A plant's cell wall helps to protect and support the cell. It provides a rigid support stand for the cell and also helps keep out some harmful substances. So if you've ever taken like a stick of celery and tried to like snapped it in half, you hear that, right? You hear that sound. That's because you're snapping the cell walls in all of the cells. Now, if you were to take that same stick of celery and boil it, it's going to become really floppy. That's because you boiled away all the cell walls and it's no longer rigid. So every time you snap any kind of vegetable and you hear that sound, It's because you're snapping all the cell walls. Pretty cool. We're powerful. We're humans. We kill things like plants. The next is cell membrane. In plant cells, the next layer inward is the cell membrane. So you have the cell wall, then the cell membrane inside. But in animal cells, we only have the cell membrane. Our cell membrane is what's called a phospholipid bilayer. Okay, phospholipid bilayer. Here are the lipids on the outside. We have what's called the hydrophilic heads and hydrophobic tails. The cell membrane's main function is that it controls what substances come into and out of the cell. So, for example, it'll let food and oxygen in, but it'll keep like harmful waste products and bacteria out. This is just an example of how important proteins are. So, whatever can't naturally diffuse through the cell membrane will go through a protein channel. So, some big nutrients or molecules that need to pass through the cell that are really important for the cell survival will go through these transport proteins. Okay, really important. There's another protein molecule for carbohydrates, another protein molecule in here that does different things. And once we talk about transport in the cell, you'll see how important proteins are. The nucleus, the brain of the cell. The nucleus contains chromatin and genetic material. All right, so the nucleus is very important. Without the nucleus, the cell would be dead. The nucleus contains DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. It's what helps cells reproduce and tells them what they should do and look like. This is why we look partly like our mom, partly like our dad, because of the DNA. And these are pictures of chromosomes. All right, that's how they look. It's very cool. This is each one of our cells has enough. So each nucleus has enough DNA to stretch 60 football fields. That's how tightly wound our DNA is, and each one of our cells has that. Think about that for a second. How much stuff, right, is in each cell, and how light it is. That there's so much DNA in our system, and yet, it's probably a couple of pounds. But it's so important because it contains all our genetic material, and it's what makes us us. It's like the alphabet of the human body. It's amazing. It's really cool. So think, every time, when we learn something, don't just take it for face value. Think really into it. Be like, wow, I can't believe that there are trillions upon trillions of these chromosomes in our bodies, and yet we don't even feel it, and we don't even feel its weight. We don't feel them move around. They're just there. We can't even feel what they're doing. It's really, really cool. Cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is a clear, thick, gel-like fluid in which almost all of the organelles are found within. All right, so think of it like some kind of Jello. So if you had like a big plate of Jello and you were to just like stick a bunch of stuff into it, that stuff won't really move. That's what the cytoplasm is. Cytoplasm is very important because without it, all the organelles would kind of just float around. They wouldn't be able to do their jobs. So the cytoplasm is a thick, clear, gel-like fluid in which organelles are found in. Okay, and it's the region between the cell membrane and the nucleus. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. A process called cellular respiration occurs in the mitochondria. It's got an outer layer and an inner. Well, it's got like two inner layers, right? So the mitochondria gives the power to the cell, and muscle cells rely heavily on mitochondria. Next is the endoplasmic reticulum, short, ER for short. It looks like a giant maze in pathways, and the endoplasmic reticulum is responsible for moving proteins made by these ribosomes over here, which we'll get into later, from one part of the cell to the other. We have two types of ERs. We have the rough endoplasmic reticulum over here because it's dotted, it's rough like sandpaper, and the smooth right here endoplasmic reticulum. That helps transport all the proteins and do its deal. Okay, so think of the endoplasmic reticulum like a warehouse, like a shipping warehouse. You get all the stuff, all the packages, and then bam, you just move it throughout the cell. It's an intercellular transportation system. Ribosomes are attached to the outer surface of the ER and are small grain-like bodies. Okay, so like again, think of it like if you ever touched sandpaper before, that's what it feels like. I'd assume, right? Because I've never really felt an endoplasmic reticulum, but think of it like that. Ribosomes make proteins. So as I've stated before, proteins are incredibly important. So these ribosomes make these very important proteins, and those proteins are transported to the Golgi apparatus. So within the ER, there's a flattened collections of sacs and tubes, and these are called the Golgi bodies. The Golgi bodies are like the shipping company of the cell. So, or well, it says the mailroom here, but you guys probably don't realize what a mailroom is. Think of it like the shipping company, like Amazon.com. Things are made, it's shipped, it's put in boxes right in the ER, and then it's shipped in trucks and whatever. And that's what the Golgi bodies are. They just the proteins would be in here, and then these little sacs will just kind of float around the cell in, and it'll either go to different parts of the cells or go to other cells. So it's very cool stuff. They're like, you could probably think of them like drones, because they just pop off and float around. So everything is packed tightly. The proteins are packed tightly into the Golgi bodies, and the Golgi bodies move around to different parts of the cell to deliver the proteins. Chloroplasts. So only in plant cells and other protist-type cells do they exist, because chloroplasts are what allow photosynthesis to occur. And photosynthesis, as you know, is the process in which plants and other photosynthetic organisms convert sunlight and carbon dioxide into sugar and oxygen. Chloroplasts give plants their green color, and like I said, they're responsible for photosynthesis. That's what they look like. And there's outer membrane and inner membrane. We have these stroma, thylakoid membranes. There's a bunch of stuff that goes on. When you get older, you'll learn the inner mechanisms of the photosynthetic process. It's very interesting stuff. Vacuoles. Vacuoles are giant storage containers of the cell. They typically, floating around the cytoplasm. All plant cells have a large central vacuole, and animal cells have smaller vacuoles. So, one of the main differences, if you're looking at an image of a plant cell and an animal cell, and you don't notice the cell wall, the giveaway that the cell you're looking at as a plant cell is a giant central vacuole. Lysosomes. Alright, lysosomes are cool. They are small round structures that contain chemicals that break down large food particles to smaller ones. And they also break down old cell parts and release substances that can be used again. So like when you're in the gym, or you're playing a sport, you're running outside, and you start smelling really bad, like under your armpits. Well, that's because your lysosomes are killing all of this like bacteria and using all this they're using all this energy produced by the mitochondria, and there's a process called like lysis. So it's basically just breaking down all of these chemicals and things that are going on in your body or being released by your body, and it makes a bad smell. So it's like the garbage. What's that called? It's like an incinerator. Take all the garbage, you put it in the lysosome burns it, and you get the waste product, and then whatever waste product there is gets taken out of the cell. So cilia and flagella. Cilia are hair-like structures that are found on bacteria and some protists. Okay, they are a bunch of tiny oars that are used for movement. So these little things help bacteria move. They move very, very, very quickly, and that helps the bacteria move. Flagella, pictured right here, this long whip, right there, that some bacteria and protists have. When they whip their tail, they propel themselves forward. All right, so they'll use it. They could also use it to hunt, so they could just whack another cell and break its membrane and kill it, and then eat the cell. Bacteria cells are smaller than plants or animal cells. They're quite tiny. They do have a cell wall and a cell membrane, but they do not have a nucleus. Instead, they have a nucleoid. Their DNA is free-floating. Organisms who lack a nucleus or a membrane-bound nucleus are called prokaryotics organisms, okay, or prokaryotes. So plant and animal cells are eukaryotic cells, and bacteria cells are prokaryotic cells. Okay, so animal and plant cells both have nucleus, membrane-bound nucleus, so they're eukaryotics, as I explained. So here's like the main differences: bacteria cell versus plant cell versus animal cell. Bacteria cell has a cell wall. Okay, it's actually made of something called peptidoglycan. The plant cell also has a cell wall, but the animal cell does not. The plant cell and the animal cell have nucleus, but the bacteria cell has a nucleoid. The bacteria cell has cilia and flagella. while the plant and animal cells do not. The plant cells have chloroplasts, but the animal and bacteria cell do not typically. So there's a lot. You could study this picture. All right, I'm not going to sit here and talk about every little detail. It'll bore you to death if you're not already bored to death. So just sit and watch it. Write it down. It'll help you a lot with the compare and contrast. So plant cells are rectangular in shape due to the cell walls. They have chloroplasts that help them perform photosynthesis, and they have a large central vacuole. Those are the main characteristics of the plant cell. So here's an image of an animal cell and an image of a plant cell. You can go back and forth to study them, see the main differences, see the components. All right, this is going to help you with your project as well. So these are important images. Remember them. That's the bacteria cell. So every time we need energy to move, our cells have to, work and give us all that energy. So every time we breathe, each individual cell has to take in oxygen, and each individual blood cell has to transport that oxygen throughout our body. All of our energy needs are met by small, tiny parts of our body that we barely even think of. All right, so the cells are so important. Right now, what's allowing me to speak is, in part my nervous system, right, and all my brain cells are working together to allow me to put together my thoughts and my words and my actions, and it's controlling my tongue and my mouth so that I can, and my my voice box, my vocal cords, so that I can communicate with you, through this magic of the internet. It's sit and think about that. We don't even think about these tiny things that make us up. We don't even feel them, and yet they are the reasons why we exist, and it's what allows us to do what we do every day. So transport within the cells. Diffusion is the main way things are transported. Diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So, for example, if you're in a room and you spray some air freshener at one side of the room, those particles are in an area of high concentration from the point in which you sprayed it, and then over time, those particles, like, you'll be able to smell the air freshener on the other side of the room because those particles diffuse throughout the room. They they do their best to get away from the area of high concentration and go to where there's more space. Important fact here: diffusion does not require energy. Okay, it's like riding your bike downhill. You're still going to get somewhere, but you don't have to pedal. You don't have to work for it. So diffusion, it can also be called passive transport. Okay, passive. That means nothing's happening, no energy. Sometimes protein channels, as I stated, can be used. Okay, through or used to transport different things. So proteins are very important. Active transport, on the other hand, is the movement of materials through a cell membrane using energy. Sometimes you need energy to move large objects, to move objects against the gradient. All right, so cells move molecules into the cell that need. By doing this, cells have more molecules, move more molecules into the cell that they need, but this requires energy because there is not a concentration difference. So there'll just be a couple of them they need to get in. There isn't an area of high concentration or an area of low concentration. So it's like riding a bicycle uphill. Sometimes you just need to get up that hill, and the only way to do it is to pedal your hardest. So there's something called osmosis, okay? And osmosis and diffusion are different. Diffusion is when you have particles move from high concentration to low concentration, and osmosis is when you have water move from high concentration to low concentration. All right, so osmosis is the diffusion of water. You want to think of it like that. That's important because that's how plants regulate their water supplies, and that's how our red blood cells work. So if our red blood cells um, carry too much water, okay, allow too much water to flow through them, they become hypotonic and they explode. Okay, like that. Boom! Red blood cells explode. If there isn't enough water, okay, or like, if what happens, like, why can't you drink seawater? Because everything will become hypertonic. meaning there'll be, all the water will rush out of the blood cells, and the red blood cells will shrivel up. What we want is isotonic solutions, which mean there's a balance of water in the cell and water out of the cell, and most of the time that's the state that we're in, and that's why our blood cells aren't bursting, which is a good thing because I can imagine that hurts. So what causes diffusion? Molecules are always moving. As they move, the molecules bump into one another, and the more molecules there are, the more collisions there's going to be. Collisions cause molecules to push away from one another, and over time, the molecules of a substance will continue to spread out, like in this GIF over here. Put a little dot of food coloring, and the molecules are always going to bump, 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 bump into each other to get away from each other, and eventually it'll take up the space of the cup.